My father introduced me, and now it's my son's turn. Woodworking is a passion we'll share forever. Woodcraft understands that. Their people know the right tool for the job, and they make sure we understand how to use it. Their help? It means a lot. Woodcraft knows how we feel because they feel the same way. You know, I enjoy sharing my secrets, and now Jake's teaching me some things too. Woodcraft, helping you make wood work.
Tight Bond Wood Glues, the pro's advantage.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of I Can Do That. I'm your host, Chad Stanton, and we've been busy making this modern drop front desk. Now in the last episode, for all intents and purposes, we did all the construction and it's pretty much ready to go. But we decided to add these end panels to it to give it a more contemporary look. Now the end panels have that 10-degree rake to it just like the rest of the project. But there are some challenges in setting this all up. We're also going to put in these aluminum dowel rods to it, and I'm going to give you the recipe for making this dark ebony stain. Alright, so I'll bring out the material and we'll start working on just this panel. So to build this end panel, I'm first going to start with the frame pieces, and that's some 1x. And I have the back style already cut to length on the bench, and that was from the plans provided at the end of this video. Now the next pieces I want to work on are the rails, and you'll notice that the front edge of the rail is cut at 10 degrees. Now it would seem that I could just take my measurement from the plans, cut to 10 degrees, and then cut it straight, and I'll be good to go. But let me show you what can happen. So here's a piece that I've cut my 10 degrees on, and I have the measurement and the line coming over from the plans. And I'm going to put this to the back style, and I'll put a clamp on this. And I want to make sure it's square. Okay, looks pretty good. Now I'll come down to the other end. Again, I have the 10 degrees on the front, and this mark here represents the length from the plans and what it should be. And again, I'll put this to the board. Make sure it's square. And put a clamp on it. Double check everything. Double check again. Okay. Now, I should be able to put this front style, and my gaps should be perfect. Well, you'll notice it fits tight up here, have a little gap at the bottom. Let's check the other end. Same thing, I'm fitting tight with a pretty big gap at the bottom. Okay, so why is that? Well, it could be several things. It could be right from our miter saw. On this one here, I have an arrow with a scale at the bottom. If I have that arrow slightly on one side or the other of that line, I'm going to be off a little. It could also be the way I measured. If I had my tape measure at the wrong point, or even marked again on the wrong side of the line for the measurement, even a pencil that isn't sharp enough, too wide of a line, again, I could be cutting it at the wrong place. The last thing that could give you that gap, well, the material could just be slightly bowed or warped in some way. So how are we going to fix that? Well, what I want to do is I want to clamp the front stile to that rail. Making sure I have no gaps there. I'm also going to clamp the back stile to the rail. And I want to check to make sure it's square. All right. Now on the front stile again, I'm going to position where the rail meets the bottom of the back stile, and I'm going to put a clamp up here, keeping that gap out. Okay, so I have that clamped, and I want to keep my gap, and then I'm going to move this back stile a little and make my mark. And you can see how far it was off. Okay, now I'm going to cut these straight on the miter saw, but I'm going to cut on the waist side and slowly sneak up to that line so I get it perfect. Okay, so I cut my rails straight, and I also, on the front stile, I cut that at 10 degrees. And I mentioned about sneaking up on the line. So let me show you what I'm actually doing there. So I have a scrap piece of wood, and I have the line that I want to cut. And imagine that this is the piece that I need to keep. I'm going to put that in my saw, and I'll bring the blade down. And I'm not going to set the blade tooth right on the line. I'm going to cut a little bit in front of it. So let me make this cut. Now, the teeth on the blade are actually a little bit wider than the actual blade itself. So what I can do is I can push this piece of wood tight against the blade. Bring the blade back up, and now that tooth, you can see, is going to be closer to the line. So I'll make another cut. Wow, you couldn't ask for any better than that. Now that little scrap cutoff that I just did, well, I'm going to use that to help hold my pieces together with a clamp. And I'm going to mark this to start putting some dowels in. Okay, so I got the frame back in the clamps, and I'm going to put some marks on it for the dowels. Now I'm going to be using some 3/8 dowels for this, and I want to make sure that these line up exactly the same. So not only will I put some reference marks to where I need to drill, but I'm going to label these so I don't get the pieces out of order. Okay, so the doweling jig, I have various different size holes that I can use, and as I said, it's going to be 3/8. I also have a 3/8 drill bit, which has a stop collar set on it, so I get just the right depth. And of course, the actual dowel rods or dowel pins have these little grooves cut in them, so the glue can get around it, and it's also slightly chamfered, making it easier to put into the hole. All right, let me clear this bench off, and I'll show you how I'm going to drill those. Okay, so I have the top rail here with my marks on it, and I'm going to put it in my vise. And the doweling jig has various different size holes, and through the window you can see an alignment mark for it. I want to get that mark lined up with my pencil mark. And tighten it up. And now I'll just drill to where the stop collar will make contact with the jig. Okay, and I'll flip it over and do the other side. Okay, now you'll notice that the dowels on the back here go in straight, but the dowels on the front, well, they're angled up. Now that's not going to be a big deal because it's still going to go together just fine for us. Okay, now we're going to be using that same doweling jig when we go to put these aluminum dowel pins in. And we're going to run into that same problem of it going up on an angle. So we have a little trick to fix that. But in the meantime, I've got to drill the rest of these holes and do some glue up. I'm ready to do some glue up, and I say some glue up for the obvious reason. If I glued the whole frame together, well, I'll never get that middle panel in there. The other thing I want to do too is, could I wait and glue it all up at the end? Well, I could, but it's awkward having all these pieces. You're just going to fight with it. So I found gluing it up partially is an easier way to go. Now, I'm going to glue this rail to the front style, not the back. The reason being is the dowel pins on the back here are straight, but the dowel pins on the front, well, they're on that angle. And then the dowel pins for the aluminum, those are going to be straight. So trying to fit this style in with the different angles, it just gets to be awkward. So I'll glue this to the front, clamp it up, and while that's drying then, I'm going to bring in the panel and start laying out where I need to make the holes for those dowel pins. And again, this back style, the dowel pins are in it just to help keep it aligned, but there's no glue on it at this point. Okay, let me get that center panel, and we already made it from the previous video, but let me bring it in here and start lining things up. Okay, so here's the center panel that we made on the last video. It's just some 3/4 inch plywood, and I did put some edge banding on it to cover up the veneer layers. Now when I put this panel in here, I also cut some spacer blocks so I can get it evenly centered in. I also, too, from the plans, I made some marks on the back stile where those 1/2 inch dowel pins will be of the aluminum. And now I want to transfer that line going all the way across. Again, I need to mark the stile where it hits the panel and then the front stile. Now this square isn't long enough to hit the front stile, so I can take another square, a framing square, or any straight edge, place it on there, and continue my marks. It's going to be tricky for me. Okay, now I can take this out and start setting up to drill the holes. Okay, I just finished drilling the holes on the back. And this is going to be a 1/2 inch dowel, unlike the 3/8 that we used on the frame. And these are drilled straight, and they're a 1/2 inch deep. Now, how do I get that 1/2 inch deep? Well, let me show you. So on the doweling jig, I'm going to take a ruler, and at the 1/2 inch mark, I'll slide the drill bit in, and I want to set the drill bit at 1/2 inch where the spurs are, not where that point is. And then with a permanent marker, I can mark on the back of the drill bit. Now, I'm going to have a different issue with this front angle. You'll notice that if I put this on here, and I was to drill, well, it's going to be at that same 10 degrees angle to it. I need it to be going in more straight. So here's how I do that. I'm going to use a wedge. Now this wedge is just some 3/4 inch wood that I cut on the miter saw at the 10 degrees. It's also the same thickness as my panel. Now, so to find the proper alignment of this jig, I'm going to put the wedge in and start it and use a square. And what I'm looking for is for the jig to be flush against the face of that square. So I'm going to keep pushing the wedge in until it becomes flush. Once I get that, you'll notice that there is a reference mark in there, just like we had before. I have to carry that reference mark onto the wedge. I also, just for quick and speed, I marked the front edge of the jig onto the wedge. So I got my marks on the wedge that would line up with the mark on the panel. But I still have to set the depth. Again, 1/2 inch we want going into this. So once again, okay, so I put the wedge in place. I'll put the drill bit through. And just like before, the 1/2 inch, I'm going to measure it and mark it off. This time I put some tape on it so I don't get the two lines confused. All right, so let me set this up and drill a hole, and I'll show you. And there we go. And one last thing. It's important to work with this wedge to the left of you. The reason being is, as we work our way down the panel, we want to make sure that there's still enough of the jig to be able to bite and hold it, because we're not getting a whole lot of gripping power up here on the wedge. All right, with that said, I've got a bunch more holes to drill, and then I'll do it on the stiles of the frame, and we can start fitting it all together. So I've put some of this together already. I've got the panel with the aluminum pins into that front stile. Now the aluminum pins is actually an aluminum rod, and I had to measure and cut each of the pins. Now in theory the pin should be 2 inches long, because I have an inch gap between my frame and the panel, and we drilled a 1/2 inch into each one of these pieces. However, I would do a dry fit first, because you either might have drilled too deep or not deep enough, and the pins can hinder you then. I also went ahead and put my spacer block back in, because I actually did drill a little too deep on this. All right, so now I'm going to put some glue on these rails and try to put the rest of this together. Now I will say, you might have to elongate your holes a little bit, because even though you do your best to line everything up, there's a good chance that it might be off a little bit. And elongating just the edge can give you a little bit of that wiggle room you need to get this together. Okay, I'm going to put some clamps on this and let it dry, and then I'm going to move on and show you how to make that custom stain. Okay, and now on to this finish. I really wanted a nice deep dark ebony stain on this project. And I don't know how many times I've been duped into this. I go to the store, I buy a can of stain, and the color on the front is not the same once it hits the wood. And depending on what type of wood you have, the stain takes different. So let me show you. This one here is supposed to be nice and black. Put that on and wipe some off. It's more kind of like a charcoal color to me. It's not as deep as I wanted. So I came up with my own formula. I took a full can of the Minwax ebony stain. I then went and got some of that calligraphy ink. And then I also picked up a little bit of violet dye. Now the violet adds just a little bit more depth to it. Now both of these I used the full amount, and I used about 1/3 of that dye in it. And I mixed it all together, and I'll show you how my stain comes out. A whole lot darker. So, after I did that, let's talk about the finish. Now the finish on this, I actually tried to spray it, and that turned into be a problem because I didn't want a brush getting in here. I thought that was going to be too difficult. So I thought spraying would be better. But once the spray hit these walls and bounced around, well, it wasn't as smooth as I would have hoped. So I think a better alternative is using a wipe-on poly for this. Again, you would use a rag and go over all the surfaces, and it'll take several coats to do that. It's a lot easier than trying to brush it on with like one of these polys. Okay, my panel should be drying up, and I'm going to get that attached and show you how it looks when we're all done. Okay, so attaching these end panels, well, it's nothing more than just clamping it on and running a couple of screws in. And speaking of screws, because these screws are kind of going to be visible, I decided instead of using like the typical drywall or wooden screw that I use on a lot of the projects, I went and bought these trim head screws. You'll notice they're a lot smaller. So it's time to sand and finish our project. And I would highly recommend, especially if you're going with these two-tone colors, that you remove the panels, stain them, finish them, and reassemble it. Other than that, your drop front desk is done. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and come back and see another exciting project that we're going to be building right here.